They keep getting bigger. If they ever make a Soul Calibur 6, Ivy's tits are going to explode. Welcome to the Gamer's Encyclopedia, an informative series detailing the histories of long-running or important series in gaming history. Well, today we're obviously talking about the Soul series, often referred to as the Soul Calibur series. This is a series of weapon-based 3D fighting games featuring a wide variety of characters and fighting styles, great gameplay and music, an interesting story, and yes, tits that get bigger with each game. Though we know of it now as the Soul Calibur series, the original game in the series went by Soul Blade or Soul Edge. This is interesting because the story of the games has to do with two swords of great power opposing each other, the evil Soul Blade, or Soul Edge depending on the localization, and the heavenly Soul Calibur. All of the characters in the game seek either one or the other sword for various reasons, both good and evil, and as the first game was called Soul Blade or Soul Edge, it made sense that the sequel would be Soul Calibur. But when the third game was called Soul Calibur 2, it seemed that from then on, that was the title of the series, and most of us just refer to it as Soul Calibur, though the official name of the series is the Soul series. What's also interesting is that the person currently directing the series, Daiichi Otoshima, wanted to call the most recent game in the series Soul Edge 2, or Soul Blade 2, but this was nixed by the publisher, Namco, and it became Soul Calibur 5. Anyway, let's take a look at the original game in the series. Soul Blade, in Japan it's called Soul Edge, was developed by Project Soul and published by Namco. It was directed by Teruaki Konishi and Ko Onda. Soul Blade was released for arcade worldwide on January 29, 1996. A second version, which fixed some bugs and added characters, was released worldwide on June 16, 1996. The PlayStation version came out in Japan on December 20, 1996 in America, sometime in January of 1997, and in Europe sometime in May of 1997. On game rankings, the PlayStation version has a 91.46, the third highest of the series, and for the first time on the Gamer's Encyclopedia, all of the entries are ranked. The story of Soul Blade is pretty simple. The evil pirate Cervantes has gotten a hold of the Soul Edge, a deadly and evil weapon that many warriors have sought throughout the ages, which also takes the form of whatever the welder's preferred weapon is, in this case dual longswords. Each character is out to defeat Cervantes, whether to stop him or to claim Soul Blade for themselves. The gameplay was a fairly simple 3D fighting game, though it was more advanced than contemporary games at the time, such as Virtua Fighter or Dead or Alive, and of course it uses weapons. It also places a heavy emphasis on the story and characters, and is one of the first games that I remember using QuickTime events for some of the endings. Obviously not counting games that were fully made up out of QuickTime events like Dragon's Lair. Hell, the term QuickTime events came from Shenmue, which was released 3 years later, and the only other game I can think of that used them at the time was Die Hard Arcade, so this is definitely one of the pioneers of the QuickTime event, for better or for worse. What's interesting is that since they're part of the endings, they can't be failed. They just offer you different things that can happen in the ending, so it gives the game a bit of replayability. If you miss the input, you'll want to go back and see what happens if you hit it, and vice versa. Soul Blade was a modest success, but it was the sequel that would immortalize the series, so let's take a look at that. Soul Calibur was developed by Namco and published by Namco, though some copies will say Namco Bandai if they were published after the merger. It was produced by Hiroaki Yodoyarama. The original arcade version was released worldwide on July 30th, 1998. The Dreamcast version was released in Japan on August 5th, 1999 in America, on September 9th, 1999, and in Europe on December 1st, 1999. It was also released for Xbox Live Arcade worldwide on June 2nd, 2008, and for iOS devices worldwide on January 19th, 2012. On game rankings, the Dreamcast version has a score of 96.94, the highest of the series. Soul Calibur was also originally going to be ported to the PlayStation, but there were technical limitations that prevented this. Namely, the new character Ivy used a sword whip that had some crazy physics that the PlayStation really couldn't handle. What's interesting is that other than one of the spin-offs, this is the only game in the series not to be available on a Sony console. The story says that after Cervantes was defeated, the Soul Edge took host in the warrior Siegfried, who has become Nightmare and more powerful than ever. However, the Soul Edge's good counterpart, the Soul Calibur, is now part of the mix. Originally, Namco wanted Soul Calibur to be a big overhaul, only taking a few characters from the first game. But this fell by the wayside as most of the characters from the first game came along, and many of the new characters will feel very familiar. Movement is less restricted, and the game flows more naturally, and of course the graphics and music are greatly improved. Soul Calibur is mostly notable for its Dreamcast port, which is not a good example of a game being ported from arcade to console, but rather an example of how porting from arcade to console can be an opportunity to improve a game, as the Dreamcast version had a host of new modes as well as improved visuals. Many people call Soul Calibur the best Dreamcast game of all time, and it certainly holds up as it was one of the very first Dreamcast games, but it still is one of the most graphically advanced on the system. Another thing that Soul Calibur did that would become a big signature move for the series was to include a character from another game. The character Yoshimitsu, originally from Namco's Tekken series, appeared as a playable character in Soul Calibur, and if anything, he's more associated with Soul Calibur and its sequels than he is with Tekken. The idea of characters from other games and media popping up in Soul Calibur would be taken up to 11 in the future games, but it all started with Yoshimitsu. One thing that the games had not yet managed to do is get multi-platform appeal. Of course they were in arcades, but as far as consoles were concerned, the first was only on PlayStation and the second only on Dreamcast. This would be fixed with the next entry, which would famously go multi-platform with differences that caused debates that rage to this day. Let's take a look. Soul Calibur 2 was developed by Project Soul and published by Namco. The original arcade version of the game came out worldwide on July 30th, 2002. The platform versions were all released simultaneously, so the game came out for GameCube, Xbox, and PlayStation 2 in Japan on March 27, 2003, in America on August 27, 2003, and in Europe on September 26, 2003. On game rankings, I'm going by the highest rated one, the GameCube version, which has a ranking of 92.12, the second highest of the series. Now, the three console versions may have all came out at the same time, but they were very different. As I mentioned, Yoshimitsu opened the idea of characters from other games appearing, and Namco took this idea to the extreme with the home versions of Soul Calibur 2 by giving each console a different exclusive guest character. The PlayStation 2 version added yet another Tekken character, Heihachi. The GameCube version gave us Link from Nintendo's Legend of Zelda series, and the Xbox version gave us the comic book character Spawn. Aside from the subtle differences in visuals that only connoisseurs of the console wars will be able to point out or care about, these characters were the differences between each version. It's almost like Namco is encouraging arguments. Anyway, it's 4 years after Soul Calibur, and Nightmare has succeeded in gathering enough souls to resurrect an ancient castle. Yeah, it's a video game, just go with it. The ceremony is interrupted, and he was defeated by the Soul Calibur and returned to being Siegfried, but after a while the Soul Edge reasserts itself and he becomes Nightmare again. There are now fragments of the Soul Edge all over the world causing evil and driving people insane, and once again people come together seeking either the Soul Edge or the Soul Calibur. Soul Calibur 2 is very much a lot like the first game, and honestly they're so close in terms of quality that whether you prefer Soul Calibur or its sequel is really only a matter of taste. Personally, I like Soul Calibur 2 more for its wider variety of characters and modes, and I enjoyed the new guard impact feature which lets you do a strong block against an opponent to throw them off of balance. As much as Soul Calibur 2 was a huge success and a great game, it seems they were bound to do something screwy eventually, and that came about with the sequel, which oddly was developed for console first and arcade later, and it eschewed the multi-platform release for exclusivity on PlayStation 2. Let's take a look. Soul Calibur 3, the arcade version, tacks on Arcade Edition, just in case you're standing in front of it and you don't know that it's an arcade machine, was developed by Project Soul and published by Namco. It was released for PlayStation 2 in America on October 25, 2005, in Europe on November 18, 2005, and in Japan on November 23, 2005. Oh, it says November instead of Japan. I must have been fucking tired when I did that. Anyway, the game did make its way to arcades in Japan on April 3, 2006, and in America on June 10, 2006. On game rankings, the original PlayStation 2 version has a score of 86.43, the fourth highest of the series. Soul Calibur 3 ditched the multi-platform releases and guest characters for a PlayStation 2 exclusive, and there was not an arcade version that it was based on, but rather the arcade version came out a year later. From what I can tell, the reason that GameCube and Xbox were left out was due to an exclusive distribution deal with Sony, though the backlash from this echoes still to this day. There were no guest characters this time around, other than Yoshimitsu, which was disappointing to many fans. The game's story this time starts off very much like a rehash of the previous game. Siegfried regains control of himself, but a short while later the Soul Edge starts reasserting itself to turn him back into Nightmare. However, this time the Soul Edge is heavily damaged by the character Raphael, and Siegfried is able to hold on to his shit long enough to grab the Soul Calibur and balance everything out. He now has both blades and is seeking a way to destroy the Soul Edge for good, but now a new character named Zasalamel has appeared, who has been manipulating everything behind the scenes and is after both swords to turn himself into the super powerful Abyss. Soul Calibur 3 was cited as being not as good as its predecessor, and it's easy to see why. The entire thing forces you to play slower, and there's a huge emphasis on blocking and breaking the enemy's defense and keeping your balance. It's a stark contrast to the fast-paced battles of the last one. Personally, I like this one quite a lot more than I had originally planned to, but I do have to say that the arcade version is miles better. It's pretty much an update to the game that fixes several issues and glitches, as well as a few new additions here and there. Soul Calibur 3 was a bit of a misstep, but it's not something that should just be passed over. It's definitely a heavier, more strategic game, though as I didn't have a PlayStation 2 when it was first released, I was heavily annoyed by the exclusivity. I did eventually get it, and I played it quite a lot, just not as much as 2. One last thing to mention is that there is a character creation mode, which is a lot of fun. And Namco specifically put in a fighting style and parts to make the character Cosmos from Xenosaga, making her a sort of guest character. She's not officially in the game, but they pretty much hand you the parts to make her on a silver platter. Next up is a spin-off, so let's look at that. Soul Calibur Legends was developed by Project Soul and published by Namco Bandai. It was released for the Wii in America on November 20th, 2007, in Japan on December 13th, 2007, and in Europe on August 28th, 2008. On Game Rankings, it holds a score of 52.29, the lowest of the series. Well, I haven't played this one, so I can't give my opinions, but I can say that this is a spin-off that is not a fighting game, but rather an action game that plays kinda like Soul Calibur. Story-wise, it takes place after Soul Edge, but before Soul Calibur, and has to do with Siegfried first fighting the Soul Edge and becoming Nightmare. There are several playable characters that you switch between, and surprisingly enough, this game does indeed have a guest character. Lloyd Irving from Tales of Symphonia appears as a playable character. Like I said, I never got to play this one, though judging by the reviews, that's probably not a big loss. Since I'm a fan of the series, if I see it cheap, I may pick it up, but that's a big maybe. Before long, though, the series would return with another big-budget entry in the series, and this one was pretty good, so let's take a look. Soul Calibur 4 was developed by Project Soul and published by Namco Bandai in Japan and America, and by Ubisoft in Europe. It was released simultaneously for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in America on July 29, 2008, in Japan, Australia, and most of Europe on July 31, 2008, and specifically in the UK and New Zealand on August 1, 2008. The Xbox 360 version is ranked slightly higher on Game Rankings with an 85.45, the fifth highest of the series. Soul Calibur 4 is interesting because instead of continuing the story, it just sort of starts a new story and discards a lot from the previous games, but it's also around this point that I stopped giving too much of a shit about the story and just played the game. Soul Calibur 4 introduces Algol, an ancient king that reappears along with his tower, and hints that he may have had something to do with the creation of the Soul Calibur. Each character has their own story mode, and almost all of them fight Algol at the end. This time there was no arcade version at all, and the guest characters were back, though for some really odd reason they were all from Star Wars. Look, I know Star Wars took place a long time ago, but I was thinking like millennia ago and not like 16th century Japan. Oh well, try not to think about it too much. Essentially, the Xbox 360 version has Yoda, and the PlayStation 3 version has Darth Vader, and both versions have Starkiller as an unlockable character. But what they did this time was that the character you didn't get was available as DLC. So, if you got the Xbox 360 version, you could buy Darth Vader as DLC, or you could get Yoda for the PlayStation 3, which essentially makes both versions the same. It's just which character you start with. Soul Calibur 4 also predictably offers online play, something that's become standard for modern fighting games. One last thing to mention is the character creation mode. It was in Soul Calibur 3 as well, but Soul Calibur 4 had a really good character creation mode, and it always amuses me to see the kinds of crazy creations that people have made online. It's worth looking into. Anyway, onwards. Next up would be another spin-off, so let's take a look at that. Vital Stats immediately! Soul Calibur Broken Destiny was developed by Project Soul and published by Namco Bandai. It was released for PlayStation Portable in Japan on August 27, 2009, and everywhere else on September 1st, 2009. On Game Rankings, it has a score of 79.74, the 7th highest in the series. This one is kind of like Soul Calibur 4 Lite, and Namco pretty much admits this, as the idea was to get people who were either new to the series or new to fighting games in general to be introduced to the game. Basically, it's the same thing as Soul Calibur 4, just without an actual story, as the story mode in Broken Destiny is considered non-canon. A lot of the characters and content from 4 are there, other than the Star Wars guys. Instead, this time around, the guest is Kratos from the God of War series. You know what's interesting? Other than in his own games, Kratos has appeared in Soul Calibur and Mortal Kombat. Maybe we'll get a Soul Calibur versus Mortal Kombat one day. Or maybe not. Anyway, other than Kratos, there was also one other original character, but basically it was very similar to 4. Not much to say here, to be honest, though I did want to mention the character creation mode, which improved on 4's by giving players an insane amount of customization for clothing and accessories and weapons, but it took away a lot of customization for the character models themselves. Oh well. So let's move on to the next and most recent game in the series. Soul Calibur 5 was developed by Project Soul and published by Namco Bandai. It was produced by Hisaru Tago. It was released simultaneously for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in America on January 31st, 2012, in Japan on February 2nd, 2012, and in Europe on February 3rd, 2012. On Game Rankings, the PlayStation 3 version is slightly higher with a 79.94, the 6th highest of the series. Yeah, I haven't bought this one yet, so my own personal comments will be slightly limited. Soul Calibur 5 does something daring, however. It time skips quite a lot more than is standard, taking place 17 years after Soul Calibur 4, and many of the returning characters have visibly aged, and there are a lot of newcomers. This time the guest character is Ezio Auditore di Firenze from Assassin's Creed 2 and its sequels, and like in 3, there's a recipe for the character creation mode to make another guest character. This time it's Devil Jin from Tekken. Soul Calibur 5 also introduces Critical Edge and many other new features, essentially giving the game super moves, which is common in many fighting games, but not so much in the 3D ones. The plot this time has to do with something called Malfestation, a curse that spreads from person to person that originated from the Soul Edge, and the main characters are the children of longtime playable character Sophidia. Like I said, this one I haven't played at all, but from what I can see, people aren't exactly thrilled. It isn't called a terrible game, but rather an average one, which is disappointing for the series' pedigree. Well, that's it for the Soul series, at least until they make Soul Calibur 6, in which Ivy's tits will explode violently, killing the entire cast. Join me next week, and we'll take a look at the series that everyone plays, but everyone also bitches about online.